Hello, and welcome to this 10th class on the book Delivered Out of Empire, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 1 by Walter Brueggemann. Today, we'll be going over Chapter 9, which is entitled Fear Outflanked by Holy Resolve. And the pivotal text for today is found in Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 through 14. And it reads, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still.'" To bring us up to what happened before, the Israelites have left Egypt, but now the Pharaoh has second thoughts. Pharaoh sets out to intercept his fleeing workforce. As the Israelites are made aware of Pharaoh's pursuit, they become gripped by despair, hopelessness, and fear. The verses that precede today's pivotal text, verses 11 and 12 of chapter 14, read, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." As I said, the people are gripped in fear. The Israelites' belief that it would have been better to stay and serve the Egyptians is framed by way of three rhetorical questions. They are meant to have obvious answers being yes in every instance. Are there no graves in Egypt? Meaning we might as well have died back in Egypt. What have you done bringing us here? In other words, thanks, Moses, you've as much as gotten us killed. And then lastly, didn't we implore you to let things stand as is? Meaning, we told you so, Moses, from the onset. And to these three very understandable responses, Moses responds with three assurances to match them. Verses 13 through 14. 1, do not be afraid. 2, stand firm. And then 3, see. See what the Lord is about to do. Then, in verse 14, Moses adds a statement that gives ground for his summons to courage. He invokes the name of Yahweh as an active agent in Israel's struggle for freedom. The slaves are not on their own in that struggle. Moses' words to the people, calling them away from fear, echo other rallying cries in history. Our author, Brueggemann, cites Franklin Roosevelt's words to the American people during World War II as an example. "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Brueggemann reminds us that, quoting him, "In fact, when President Roosevelt made that statement of assurance, there was indeed much to fear. So also with Moses, the fear not is thrown in the face of much to fear, for Pharaoh was determined to prevail over the escapees." These assurances in the face of great obstacles and danger are made time and time again in the scriptures, including the Gospels. In the case of Moses' assurance, we may take away two important dimensions, as Brueggemann puts it, two important dimensions of the claim made for Yahweh and Yahweh's relationship to Israel. 1, Yahweh is assigned an active role as an agent in the deliverance from Pharaoh. God is not passive, watching things play out or serving it as an advisor or something. God is about to enter into the story in a visceral and aggressive way. And the second important dimension is that divine agency is expressed in military terms. Moses asserts, "The Lord will fight for you." And then later we read of how the Egyptians feel as though the Lord is fighting against them and on behalf of the Israels. So these two dimensions, one, that God is an active agent and that God is fighting for the people. As to the nature of the divine agency, Brueggemann calls our attention to the fact that in Exodus 14, that the people seem a bit muddled as to just the nature of God's intervention. Is this a work of an angel, as is said in verse 19? Is it the work of a cloud of fire, as is a cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, as is mentioned in verses 19 through 21? Or was it a strong east wind that paved the way? Of this confusion, he writes, one can tell that the narrator is unsettled and indirect about divine agency because Israel has no single clear way of speaking about it. They are trying to describe the indescribable. As they know, and what the Egyptians know, all they know, and what the Egyptians know is that it is the Lord who has brought this about. We can read that in verse 25, the Egyptians even acknowledging this. How this was done remains mysterious. Opinions as to how God intervenes in modern times is met with still more questions, given that the matter of divine agency in the modern world of enlightenment rationality is highly contested. To this, Brueggemann asserts, in quoting him, it is futile to attempt to explain divine agency in modernist terms, either to confirm it or to explain it away. It is unmistakably clear, nonetheless, that the narrative claims of faith cannot finally do without some mode of divine agency. For Brueggemann, the question of how God intervenes is not so important as the faith claim that God is actively working on behalf of the oppressed for their liberation. This is his long way of saying, don't bother yourself with the logistics. Cling to the faith claim that somehow, some way, and in a mysterious fashion, God is actively engaging the world, bringing about liberation for those who are oppressed. And I clipped over here this article that completely misses the point that Brueggemann is trying to make, as if this article were in conversation with Brueggemann. I doubt it. With the heading, no, really, there is scientific explanation for the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus. Well, again, even if there were, misses the point. The point is God is on the move and actively working towards the liberation of the people. So good. God intervenes on behalf of the oppressed. However, Brueggemann writes, the ante is upped in the rhetoric of divine agency when we see that divine agency is expressed in military terms. Moses asserts, the Lord will fight for you. The Egyptians agree with this claim after the wheels begin to fall off their chariots and their efforts appear as futile. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt, as I've said a couple of times in verse 25 of chapter 14. Yahweh is an active militaristic arm of defense and then offense on behalf of Israel and against Egypt. This image of God is harder to swallow in the 21st century. Of this, Brueggemann writes, such a description of Yahweh is offensive in much of contemporary Christian faith, certainly in the peace church traditions, but more broadly to those Christians in the West, and especially in the United States, who eschew the identification of the will of Yahweh with modern military might. Thus, the purging of our hymnals of such militaristic imagery is an important interpretive maneuver. But after we have said all of that, the imagery persists in our most elemental narratives, and we must attend to it on that basis without for an instant accepting subsequent ideological and political use made of such rhetoric. What is at stake in the narratives of divine agency expressed in military imagery is the insistence that there is a willful purpose at work in the world that disputes the claims of Pharaoh and that the capacity to override the claims of Pharaoh. This usage attests a counterforce for emancipation that can trump the enslaving force of Pharaoh. My paraphrase, the most important point is this: God takes action in our world to liberate oppressed and enslaved peoples. God is an active agent in the world, calling all peoples towards emancipation and reconciliation. In the time of Moses, empires, nations, and tribes did not think about liberation in terms divorced from earthly military might and power. The God we meet in the Exodus narrative is cast in the image of a God as God was perceived in that epic. There are, however, spiritual and theological threads that will come centuries later that challenge the idea that God is primarily a cosmic warrior. Of this, Brueggemann writes, to be sure, a subsequent theology of the cross in Christian tradition finds the power of God in weakness and not in the categories of worldly power. In these earlier narratives and poems, however, That interpretive maneuver has not yet been made. Again, his long way of saying that this story comes in such a time where we could not conceive of power working for the people outside of a militaristic framework. And so in that vein, the story comes to us using those metaphors, that image, that idea. But as Jewish theology would progress, and by the time Christian theology comes onto the scene, we think about God's power and might and action in the world in different terms. And this is a development. So we can take the main point for what it is, that God will take action in our world to liberate and oppressed enslaved peoples. That is the primary point. Brueggemann reminds us that biblical faith includes a trajectory of emancipation alongside a trajectory of reconciliation. He notes how societies will tilt towards one over the other, depending on the context. Sometimes the drive to emancipation overwhelms calls to reconciliation. Ours is a culture that often tilts towards reconciliation with less emphasis on the need to emancipate entrapped peoples. This is a trend that will occur again and again in history. In the antebellum South, slaves were encouraged to forgive their masters by those who intended to keep the institution of slavery intact. In our own day, consider how quickly white America wished to move towards reconciliation with Japanese Americans after they were interned during World War II. True emancipation would have meant the full return of their stolen property, along with meaningful restitution. Quoting from the Washington Post, Japanese Americans lost as much as $6 billion in property and income because of their forced removal and incarceration, according to a 1983 federally commissioned study that adjusted for inflation and interest. The government froze bank accounts, labeled them enemy alien assets. Speculators took advantage of wartime prejudices to buy land for a fraction of its value. More than 4 decades later, Japanese Americans received $20,000 in reparations and a presidential apology. Again, more than 4 decades later. This is widely felt to be an inadequate compensation and far too late. The generational impact on the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Japanese Americans is still felt today. And if you want to come back and watch this later and write down the website from pbs.org that talks some of the longstanding effects. And of course, corollaries can and should be drawn between the effects of Japanese Americans and the impacts of systemic racism on African American communities. And here I've included an article written by a scholar from Australia to bring it out of our context and overseas to somebody else writing about our situation, to perhaps give it a more of a third party take on it. All this to say, when oppressive systems and empires fall, it is not uncommon for those who maintain the systems or benefit by them to hope for reconciliation between them and for those liberated. But, quoting Brueggemann, before there can be reconciliation, there must be emancipation, and that requires a strong counterforce. Or said another way, there must be justice via emancipation before there can be peace, that is reconciliation. And what he's doing here in the story in Exodus chapter 14 is citing one example where the strong counterforce made way by the hand of God, nonetheless, by Yahweh, in the Red Sea is an emphatic exclamation point on the end of a sentence that insists on emancipation, and that God will move heaven and earth to make it so. He goes on to write, however, it is a great seduction of dominant ideology, fostered, of course, by the elites who manage that ideology, to prefer a gospel of reconciliation rather than to recognize the hard-nosed reality that belongs to emancipation. All this to say, reconciliation and emancipation go hand in hand. Today's story about the Egyptians' fate should sober the mind of any ruler who has ever subjugated a people, or any person who has benefited by such practices. The God of all is working to bring an end to such practices. In Exodus, those who were willing to ride on Egypt's coattails to the end shared in its demise. Ultimately, this will always be the fate of evil empires and those that cling to their rule. But let's bring it back to the people, the Israelites, those who are being liberated. Ultimately, this story is meant to instill hope in those who are trapped in hopeless circumstances in every age. Enslavement may take many forms: addiction, domestic abuse, poverty, wage slavery, and literal slavery. This is a story about a people who were enthralled by fear, but then the prophet Moses assured them with words about God's intent to liberate them. They were asked to wait and to watch and see what God would do. Then they were delivered in a spectacular and unexpected way. In fact, in a way that defied explanation. In response, the people praised their deliverer. And Brueggemann concludes his chapter with some comments from another biblical commentator, Michael Walzer, quoting Brueggemann and then in a bit paraphrasing Walzer. This transaction of fear, assurance, deliverance, and praise is rooted in a specific memory in Israel. The entire sequence is, however, reiterated again and again in the worship of the congregation and in the lives of those who recognize their own experience in this narrative. The abiding contemporaneity of the transaction is well said by Michael Walzer in his work on Exodus as a revolutionary text. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, there is no way from here to there except by joining together and marching. I've decided there's 4 long questions in this week's chapter, and I've decided to focus on the third and the fourth. I just think that if we try to tack on all 4, we won't have time. So I decided to choose the 2 that I felt were most germane to my overview and synopsis of the chapter. So I'll ask that you unmute yourselves, and we will start with the third question, which reads, the author draws a firm distinction between emancipation, the resolve to deliver the vulnerable out of bondage, and reconciliation, bringing together adversaries through forgiveness. Why do you think those who are privileged so often try to pursue peace or reconciliation before justice for the exploited, emancipation, has been achieved? How and why do communities of faith in particular lose sight of emancipation, separating the biblical concept of salvation from socioeconomic realities? How can you and your community work to address this?
We've been long conditioned by our concepts of justice that we forget about forgiveness.
So you're expressing an example of the pendulum swinging hard towards justice without the thought of reconciliation.
Yeah, and the example is South Africa.
Yeah.
Bishop Tutu.
Yeah. Yes. I usually, being somebody who has not how do I put this? I bringing it into my own life and my own context and my own relationships, to use an example from my home. After I've done something to that drives me to need to ask for forgiveness and seek forgiveness and reconciliation with someone I love, whether it be Kelly, my wife, or one of my kids, I am often wanting to move quickly to the reconciliation piece. As soon as I feel sorry enough, by my estimation, I'm wanting them to forgive me so we can move on with our day. And sometimes I push the conversation into that place too quickly before I have really made recompense or really owned up to or faced the gravity of what my word or my act had done. And that's a personal example of what happens sometimes in cultures collectively, where after a societal redress has been acknowledged, or the need for societal redress has been acknowledged, and and a culture has moved towards some form of reconciliation, whether it be towards civil rights for various minority groups, or justice for different persons. We want to get to the forgiveness piece before we really sat time addressing the systemic issues that gave rise to the injustice.
We don't like the pain of doing that.
No. And so you need both is the point. And I think Brueggemann is right in noting that in amongst people who are wanting the forgiveness or wanting to be reconciled from a position of privilege or power, it's far too convenient to just say, well, you need to forgive everyone of the pain and just move on. Let's move on. Why do you keep bringing this up? Well, obviously there's still pain. Why do you keep bringing this up? Can't you just forgive? I'm reminded of an Amish community in South America that I read about once, where sexual abuse is rampant or has been rampant for some time. And one of the reasons it's allowed to persist in that community is because they take the words of Jesus where he said, forgive, forgive. They take that so literally and as the only important thing that when an abuser is brought before the council of elders, they ask for forgiveness, they are forgiven and then restored to the home where the abuse occurs. So there's a radical, extreme example of having a pursuit of reconciliation through forgiveness without addressing any of the need for justice and a change to the system or the circumstance that brought about the injustice in the first place. And what Brueggemann is saying is you need both. And he is saying that in Exodus 14, with the flood in the Red Sea and the swallowing up of the Egyptians in the pursuit of reclaiming the Israelites as slaves, you have a very grandiose, very large example of an intervention on behalf of emancipation. And I used the example of it's like an exclamation point on a sentence that it's like a triple exclamation point on a sentence that demands justice and emancipation. And if we were to only take this chapter as the only story about liberation, then you would get no reconciliation because let's face it, the Egyptians are swallowed up and there is no reconciling with the Egyptian people in this story. But Brueggemann highlights this to counterbalance the tendency of cultures of persons with privilege and power to want to move straight to reconciliation without the acknowledgement that God is going to liberate. And so you better get on board with that effort and then work towards the reconciliation. I don't know if that all makes sense, but that's my best way of explaining it.
I think the struggle covers is the challenge to us, and that's why we have so much trouble with it. It's painful, whether we see it as justice or we deal with our own guilt and seek forgiveness. It's a lot of issues to have to deal with.
I'll tell a very personal story that so just last week I was waiting for Josie to get into the van. She was taking too long to get into the van. And so what I meant to do was elevate her with, like, I was carrying stuff in my arms, like bags. We were going sledding, I think. Yeah, we're going sledding. So I had like all the bags of the heavy clothes. And I tried to like sort of be like use my leg as a chairlift into the van. But what I ended up doing was kneeing her in her butt. And so she started to cry. I did not hard, but it was enough. It was more that she was upset that I had done it, not that it necessarily hurt her. And she was wearing like padded pants and everything. I don't want to give the wrong idea about what happened. Anyway, and it wasn't my intent, whatever. She was upset. So what I did was I said, Josie, I'm sorry. And then she kept crying. And I said, you need to stop crying. I'm sorry. Now,
Does that compute?
it's not for me to insist that the pain stop that I inflicted, even if it was unintentional, because I am ready to move on. And you take that culturally speaking, where people are speaking out of great pain. And the people who are ready to move on say, it's time to move on.
But they don't see the pain.
Don't see
They
the
don't.
pain.
They don't see the pain.
Yeah,
I
they want to
think this
sweep
is-
it under the rug and get on with life.
I think of our Native Americans and I know that even to this day, even though they say they corrected the situation, that there are Native Americans that live without water
Mm-hmm.
and without electricity sometimes. And yet we do nothing about it. We just want to shut our eyes. We put them in a part of the country where we don't have to see it. So if we don't see it, we don't think about it. And we think we've taken care of the situation, and we haven't. We haven't taken care of the situation.
You hit the nail right on the head, Sue. That's exactly. And the sobering part of today's story is that God will liberate the poor. God is, our faith as believers is that God is bringing liberation to humanity. And in the final thing, I mean, I'm preaching from Luke chapter 6 this week, where you have the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, but then you have these woes. And I was thinking that in juxtaposition with today's story, woe to the rich, for woe to those who are fed, for you have had your fill. Woe, it's like saying that those who don't become a part of God's restorative work in the world, who cling to their wealth and their positions of power, like Pharaoh in the story, they ride that raft till it sinks. And I'm reminded too of Thomas Jefferson's quote when he was a slave owner himself, fathered children but he said, I something, if I remember the quote imperfectly, that we should be, I don't know if he used the word afraid or forget exactly what he used, but at the thought that God is just. We should I gotta find this quote because I'm butchering it.
While you're looking, I think we can also think about the population around us. I mean, we have the food pantry and we provide opportunities for people to come and get food, but yet there are still people on the streets. And I will say that that's where some of them want to be, and there's nothing we can do about that. But there are other places where someone's lost a job and now they've lost everything, and they just need a hand to help them out. So, that brings it back to a closer community that we need to reconcile with.
That's a great segue into the next question I want to talk about. But first, I'll read this quote because I found it. He in an address to the state of Virginia, or notes on in his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference." And Brueggemann would want to say, well, in Exodus chapter 14, we have quite a display of supernatural interference. But that was the quote I was trying to.
When Jefferson died, they had the largest sale of slaves. Have you been to Monticello? Yeah,
I have.
That's
not
one of the
been,
things that
I'm
they'll
aware.
tell you on the lawn as you getting the tour. They'll say, here is where they had the largest sale of slaves. So yeah, it's hard to understand how. But you know what? I was surprised. The slaves apparently had some way to earn, to either grow crops or something for themselves. And they were able to earn some sort of an income, and they would go and buy like dishes and things. When we went into the slave area, that they showed the possessions of some of the slaves, and so even though we had slaves, I do believe they were probably treated more fairly than most slaves.
I don't know. So I can't speak to Jefferson's situation specifically. Oh, and enough to address that. I do know that many slaves were responsible for raising their own food and providing their own sustenance, in addition to, and this was broadly true across plantations all throughout.
Yeah, but in general, it was just terrible what was done to those slaves for hundreds of years. And after so-called emancipation, they really weren't emancipated. They lived under Jim Crow, and and it was just as bad as before. And even, and it goes on until today, that those of us who are, more privileged have a hard time understanding what happened, over 400 years, and there's to achieve, true justice. It hasn't happened yet. And I don't know that, expecting total forgiveness is realistic, maybe.
That's exactly the reconciliation. I think what many people who I've heard talk about these things, don't want to be too general. I've heard some people comment on who I'll just say are more overtly racist. I know people in my life who I would call overt racists. People from various people I've met along the way, and one of their fears is that should there be emancipation and justice, this is what's at the heart of their fear, I think. Then those people that have been oppressed will do to us in this new balance of power what has been done to them out of a motive of vengeance or other things. And that's where the reconciliation piece becomes so important, and why you're citing South Africa was so important, Larry, because in that instance, what you find was not the case, has not been the case, that you have had movements towards reconciliation, but a hard naming of truth working in conjunction. And we just haven't been able to walk and chew gum at the same time here in the United States. We've either wanted to pretend that we arrived at the mountaintop with Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech on the Washington Mall, and then we were great, and as if he was always and ever standing there. And I guess what I'm saying in so many words is you're right. You're right, Nancy.
Well, so there are just so many areas where there's still all these inequalities, whether it's in loans or housing or, all of these things. And even you hear about it in the news all the time, how police are treating, people of color differently when they stop them on the street. In the car or whatever. It's there's still all sorts of, inequalities. And they just had a Supreme Court ruling about Alabama, that they've, redistricted. So there's, pressing voting rights in Alabama. And the judge said they're going to, that districting is not acceptable. And then the Supreme Court said, oh, well, there's not time to change it before the election. And so again, it's just all over the place. And it does remind me of a person in my family whose parents were divorced, and then father remarried, and the second wife was very uh, unwilling to accept this daughter from the former marriage. She wasn't allowed to come over. She wasn't even allowed to call her father. To go to her prom, she had to come to our house to get her picture taken because she wasn't allowed to be over there at her father's, because the second wife was so resentful of her. And so now, years later, the stepmother comes up to her and said she'd, like to, set up, change things and have a better relationship. And this daughter says she just can't do it. She'll be civil to her, but, she can't forgive her. She was in therapy for years over all of this, so, I mean, really, I think it would be good if she could forgive her, but right now she says she just can't. She can't do it. It's too much. It was too much hurt over so many years. And it's just really hard to say, oh, let's move on. I mean, let's move on and now everything will be fine. It's hard to make that fine after all this time. So, I mean, that's just one case, but I mean, I can look at people who were discriminated against for, hundreds of years. It's really hard to correct that. And it hasn't all been fixed anyway, but I think it's, it's easy to say, oh, let's just have reconciliation and move forward, but it's not easy to do that. And it's not worked in for this family member. I think it's just not going to happen. And I get it. And, it's just too hard for her to reconcile, after all the hurt, years of hurt. And so, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. I don't have the answer, but it's just
we probably have been that person or have those people in our lives where they're quick to say, I said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And what they're really saying, what we wanting to say is, until you have demonstrated by your actions that you are willing to live differently with me in relationship, then you can keep saying that, and I can forgive you as many times as I feel possible to forgive. But until there's a fundamental change in the way, then and sometimes there's forgiveness without reconciliation. I've heard of that too, where people say, I cannot be in community with that person anymore, but for my own sense of well-being, I have decided to forgive them. But it's not for I guess the main thing I'm wanting to highlight is it's not for the person who did the thing or for others outside of the situation to insist that the time has come to forgive and move on. That's the problem that we run into, that I'm guilty of. That's why I brought that silly story with Josie. Right. What I was really annoyed with was that she was crying while we were packing up the van. I just wanted her. Heath Jones, wanted her to be done. But that's not.
I don't want to go home, Daddy.
I think of that lady, and for the life of me, I can never remember her name. It's Kerr down in Terre Haute.
Eva Core.
Yeah, Eva Core. Okay. I just think of her. She's the only one that I can think of who actually did reconcile, and both parties agreed.
Eva Core.
This is such a hard thing. It's got to be the hearts on both people. Both, someone has to recognize there's a wrong, because many times we don't realize we've wronged somebody, and then the person that's been wrong has to be able to forgive. That's a Christ thing. That's he's the one that does that forgiving. I don't know. It's really hard.
Occasionally you'll hear where someone has killed somebody in the family, say, and then the person whose loved one was shot or whatever comes around and really makes a true I forgive you, to the person who was guilty. And sometimes those stories come out just wonderful, but it would be so hard to do.
Mm.
We have a current trial situation going on that reflects the need for that,
Mm.
in which the deputy who was
Mm-hmm.
killed when
Mm.
he was trying to help that guy out of the car in the accident.
Right.
And the trooper's father, he just wants him to die.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I one of the stories that I've told a couple times in sermons, but it was impressed upon me, the need. So there's one thing, what we've been talking about, the need to seek forgiveness and insisting that others forgive us before they're ready, and that's something that we just have to demonstrate that we're willing to live better, and that's all we can do. But from the other side, this speaks more to Eva Kors as a shining example of being liberated from the pain by forgiving, which is her testimony and a very powerful one. I once lived with a counterexample of that with a man I worked with at the corn mill, who was about the meanest person I had ever known. He was mean to me. He was a bully. But he got hit by a young lady strung out on drugs while he was riding his motorcycle, and it just crushed his leg up and down. Then I actually got the job I got because he was gone while he was healing, and then he came back. And then he got a DUI and needed me to drive him to work. I was the one who lived closest to him, so he asked me, after asking everyone else, to drive him to work. And he treated me kindly for about the 2 months I drove him to work every morning. And then he reverted back to his ways. But he told me in one of those car rides that if he could get away with it, if he found himself in a position to put a bullet in that young lady's head for doing that thing to him, and there would be no repercussions, legal repercussions, he would do it in a heartbeat. And he said it with such anger. I realized, and I said to him, as long as you feel that way, it's like she's running you over with her car every day of your life, again and again and again. And he never did forgive her, but you see there in his life an example of how that anger and hatred will eat you alive. And I never forget the way the car felt when he said that, because it was like you just could hear the pain and anger coming out of him. And his need to forgive was, for his own sake, was so obvious. And so there's that too. Now, back to what we said earlier, if that young lady found him and said, it's time for you to forgive me, I feel ready for you to do this, she can't. That's not for her. That's her own. Hopefully she stopped doing drugs and did what she could do, But from just straightly from his vantage point, you can see easily the freedom, the liberation he would feel if he could forgive her. But he never did. He never did. He's since died. But
that kind of pain goes so deep and is expressed not only toward just the person who did it to him, but everyone else around him. It's a terrible way to, well, maybe he was that way before, because you said he was, right? He was sort of a mean person.
I didn't know him before the accident because I got his job after his accident. I got a job but he, from what people said, before I met him, he was one of the most difficult people to get along with, unless you were one of the other. He was like an adult version of a bully on a playground, where he had a couple people who were.
I'm guessing his childhood was not pleasant.
I'm thinking that must have been.
A lot of
Good.
insecurity,
I don't say that again.
a lot of insecurity was involved by my layperson's assessment.
Yeah, yeah. I know that now. At the time, it just he projected himself as just having lots of confidence and something to say about everything.
There's a lot of those around.
Yeah, yeah.
Right around. They'll tell you anyway. I know. I have my own opinions.
Yeah. Well, I am, again, that's one of the problems with interpreting these biblical stories is we talk about them in like polar opposites, like there's the righteous and the unrighteous, and which are you? And I find within this conversation, even I am on a sliding scale depending on the person and depending on the day.
Yeah, the gray area is always bigger
Mhm.
than
I think there's the
negative or
person
the positive.
I think there's the person who thinks they're righteous
Mhm.
and the person that may not act like they're righteous. I don't think we have any of the real righteous. No. There might be a few around, but
And they
most of
don't
them
know,
are
and they don't brag about it and hardly know it. There are some people in my life that I've known who I feel are the most, they most embody the Christ-like spirit. You know what I'm talking about, but they don't.
they don't boast about it.
Mhm,
You just know it because of the way they act
mhm.
and the way they respond to people.
Well, we've got 10 minutes before 3:00. I don't think I'm going to move on to the other question. I feel like we've had a good discussion as we are, unless you all want to consider it. I feel like this conversation took the course it was supposed to. Today was supposed to be about reconciliation, forgiveness, and justice, and all those things. And I feel like we've landed at a good place, which is to say, we don't quite know.
I'm just not quite sure how reconciliation works with this story. I
Mhm.
mean,
It doesn't. to me.
Pharaoh and the 600, I think it was, in the military with their chariots, and they looked upon the dead bodies on the shore.
Yeah.
No
This-
reconciliation.
He didn't do as good a job explaining here's what I think he was trying to do. No, reconciliation does not belong to this story. This story serves as a counterweight to those who only talk about reconciliation. The counterweight being God does bring about actively in the world justice. That's a faith claim. It's a claim made again and again in the scriptures that God is intervening on behalf of justice to bring the book of Revelation in the Christian scriptures is all about justice, just sort of coming down upon creation to bring about a new heavens and a new earth. And so what he's trying to do is to show that this story is a cautionary tale to those who would only insist upon reconciliation, forgiveness, without acknowledging that sometimes things have to radically change. And some people go down with the ship. Empires go down with the empire. Persons go down with whatever evil empire they serve defending. And this was not a story about reconciliation. He brought it up as to rightly point out that both the emancipation and the reconciliation need to go together. That was the point, but I don't feel that was very clear. I felt this chapter was harder to parse out.
And at the end, when we get to that new place, there's not going to be any reconciliation for those that go to hell.
there are parts, there are parables told by Jesus, and certainly the image of Revelation of people who will not be reconciled. There are those who hope for a universal reconciliation and believe that's God's intent. And whether or not it's possible whilst respecting the free will of all persons is something we will have to wait and see.
That's right. That's for the future. We don't. I heard someone say the other day that they would go to hell for a little while, and it would be like being in prison, and they'd have to serve their time. And then once they serve their time, they'd be able to come to heaven. I thought, okay, I don't read that in the Bible, but if you do, that's fine. I'm not going there.
That's a kind of a cartoonish version of when Jesus spoke about like Gehenna. He pointed to Gehenna was this refuge of burning trash outside of Jerusalem. And when he is talking about what's translated as hell, he's pointing to this refuge of burning trash and using it as a metaphor for the consequences of failing to live into the realm and purposes of the realm of God, the purposes of God. And the point is more about the cost of rejecting love, where even receiving the love in light of God feels as agony, because you've probably, my person I was just talking about, who I worked with, when he would receive overt acts of kindness on my behalf, it made him mad. So he would receive what I was giving as kindness as unkindness. So that idea that those who reject, we see it all the time in our world, people who reject light and love and pay the consequences personally for it. So whenever I hear somebody describe hell, like your person you were talking to does, as this sort of, I don't know, I say cartoonish, this sort of, I just feel they're missing the point, but okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just leave you with that. We'll end with a conversation about musings about hell, and I'll see you next week. Next week we're doing the last chapter of the book, and then we are going to do what the Sunday school classes are doing. And some of you already have this book. We're just going to go with that day's devotion in this Advent devotional. So if you've picked up a copy, well and good. We're going to mail one to Judy and anyone else who hasn't received one. And I figure we just need a break. We've been okay. Well, there's one here for you, Larry.
Okay.
We've been going through the Torah, for what, almost 2 years now. I think we started in June of 2020.
Yeah.
We're still, so it's time and then we'll go back to finish Exodus after Easter, is my plan. So next week we'll have the last chapter, and then we'll take a week off, and then on Ash Wednesday we'll resume.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds like a plan. We can do that.
Where can I get a cup?
There are 5 copies here at the church for anyone. Just get one Sunday. I'll tell Sherry that you need one, or you can remind me on Sunday. I know where they are in her office. And
They're there where the devotional books are.
Oh, so they're in the annex area. Okay. Well, anyway, there's one here for you, Janet.
Okay, thanks.
And with that, I leave you, and God bless, and thank you for your time. And I'll see you tomorrow morning, Sue.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Bye.
take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. See you later.